Hi, everybody. I'm Geraldo Rivera, and I'd like to bring your attention to a program, a very special program we're doing on the evening of December 27th at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, repeating at 1 o'clock on the 28th, the morning of the 28th. We're calling it The Waiting List. Let me just give you a little background. Back in 1972, I reported perhaps the most important story of my life. It was an expose of the dreadful conditions inside a huge institution for people we then described as mentally retarded. It was called Willowbrook, and it was located right here in New York on the borough of Staten Island. At the time, there were about 6,000 people, mostly young people, inside this huge institution for the mentally retarded. They called it a state school, but there was very little in the way of education or rehabilitation or any of that kind of positive work going on. Essentially, this was a grim and awful and filthy and underattended institution. Where in medieval conditions, people with developmental disabilities were kept. I remember the staff there got me a key. I went into this building 6, the B ward, and what I saw was something I'd never seen or even thought of or contemplated before. It was really human beings being kept under conditions that were worse than the worst dog kennel. It was filthy. There were naked children moaning and rocking back and forth. They were hiding under sinks or benches. They were hitting their heads against walls. It was appalling, and it affected me in a very deep way. And in many ways, it is the nightmare that continues to haunt me. I can conjure up the sight, the sound, and the smell of that Willowbrook experience in a heartbeat. I went to speak because of thinking about the issue and wanting to see where things stand on the issue, to the ARC. It used to be called the Association for Retarded Children. Now it's called the ARC. It's an association nationwide, and indeed international, that works with the families of the developmentally disabled. The idea we found out shortly after Willowbrook, which was closed along with most of the big institutions, was the best way to care for people with intellectual disabilities was in the community. In very small community-based homes where they could be cared for and treated and educated and loved on a one-to-one basis. So we created, through various fundraising activities, these community-based services throughout the country. Many, many organizations, from Catholic Charities to ARC to many groups around, WORC, W-O-R-C, many groups established these community residences to take the children from these big institutions that were closing. So I went and made a speech to the ARC National Convention. It was in Albuquerque, New Mexico last month, and I found something deeply disturbing. I was ebullient about everything that had changed. I was very positive, very upbeat about how everything had changed for the formerly institutionalized people, the residents, the patients, the students, whatever you want to call them, of these big state schools around the country. The people in that audience, though, were a lot more measured than I was. Their optimism was a lot more muted than mine. The reason is, as we close these big institutions, the thought was that people moving in the community would have services provided by the locality, by the state, by the federal government, services that incidentally are far less expensive than keeping them in the big institutions. But what I found out at the ARC convention in Albuquerque, New Mexico in November was that there are huge waiting lists now for people with developmental disabilities to get these services in the communities. There are huge waiting lists for many of the community-based homes. Indeed, according to the families and some of the disabled themselves who now can advocate for themselves, the waiting list had become the new institution. It was the new problem we had to address, we had to fix. The waiting list. We had to make sure that these services were delivered to this population. We had to make sure and guard against the instinct to reopen institutions and shove them back in to these dark warehouses where they could be forgotten, out of sight, out of mind. We had to watch what was going on. There are millions and millions of people. There are 54 million people with disabilities of one sort or another in this country. There are many, many hundreds of thousands of developmentally disabled, intellectually disabled, you see them on the Special Olympics, who need these services. This program is both an exaltation of everything that's been accomplished since my long ago original expose of Willowbrook in 1972 when I was brand new in the news business, a young man, just 26 years old. You know, it's going to be, so we're going to salute everything that's happened in a positive way, but we're also going to point out everything that needs to be done, everything that needs to happen. We're going to have, remember Corky, a young man with his own disability who became an actor on TV. He's going to be on. Clay Aiken, the American Idol who's now on Broadway. He's got an organization now that advocates for people with disabilities being treated in a normal, quote-unquote, fashion out in the community, not in the dark recesses of an institution. Tim Shriver from the famous Kennedy family. His mom, Eunice Shriver, the founder of Special Olympics. Tim is going to be on board. It's a very, very special program. I'm so happy that we're airing it during the holiday season, you know, 2 days after Christmas. I hope you check it out. It's called The Waiting List. It's on the Fox News channel, 10 o'clock Eastern, repeating at 1 o'clock on the 28th, the morning of the 28th. So it's December 27th, 10 p.m. Eastern. The Waiting List, reported by me and our team, and starring Tim Shriver, Clay Aiken, Corky, and a huge cast from around the country. I hope you check it out. Thank you very much.
Well, I visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because of lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions. Both need a tremendous overhauling. I'm not saying that those who are the attendants there or the ones that run the institution are at fault. I think all of us are at fault. And I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
It's been more than 6 years since Robert Kennedy walked out of one of the wards here at Willowbrook and told newsmen of the horror he'd seen inside. He pleaded then for an overhaul of a system that allowed retarded children to live in a snake pit. But that was way back in 1965, and somehow we'd all forgotten. I first heard of this big place with the pretty-sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, a Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, and the children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces, they were making a pitiful sound, a kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life?
Yes, there are 5,300 patients at Willowbrook, which is the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world. The ones that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands there like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone, only 1 or 2 or 3 people to take care of 70 people on the ward, sharing the same toilet, contracting the same diseases together. 100% of patients at Willowbrook contract hepatitis within 6 months of being in the institution. Most patients at some time in their life have parasites. The incidence of pneumonias is greater than any other group of people that I think exist in this country. Trauma is severe because these patients are left together on a ward, 70 retarded people, basically unattended, fighting for a small scrap of paper on the floor to play with. fighting for the attention of the attendants who are overworked, trying to clean them, feed them, clothe them, and if possible pay a little attention to them and work with them and develop their intelligence. But what in fact happens is that they go downhill.
2 days after our first unofficial visit, a camera crew was given an authorized tour of the facility. While unannounced, we'd found the children naked and basically unattended. They were shown kids who were fully clothed and generously attended. It was to ensure that this sudden improvement in the quality of life was permanent that we returned without the knowledge of the school administration and through a back door. It was the first day all over again.
For these people, life is just 1 hour after another of looking at the floor. There's no training going on here.
Can the children be trained?
Yes, every child can be trained. You know, these kids, there's no effort. We don't know what these kids are capable of doing. Some training programs go on at Willowbrook, but the state provides a bare minimum, just enough so that they can call this place a school. The state, clearly these kids aren't getting any training. I mean, I don't think I even have to say that. They're just sitting here on the ward. These are the hours during which they should be in school, and they're not.
What ward is this now?
This is building 27. These patients do have clothes on today, but as you can see, the one thing that can't be hidden is that there are no training programs, that all these patients do is sit during the day. They're not kept occupied. Their life is just hours and hours of endless nothing to do, no one to talk to, no expectations, just an endless life of misery and filth. What you see, it makes you think that it's hopeless that they can't be trained, but you know, they only look this way because they haven't ever had opportunity for training. You know, if you or I were left to sit on a ward surrounded by other mentally retarded people, we would probably begin looking like this too.
The Willowbrook State School is this country's largest home for the mentally retarded. It's called a school, but that's more a statement of aspiration than of fact. Fewer than 20% of the 5,230 people who are kept here attend any kind of classes. When the state of New York entered a period of economic retrenchment 2 years ago, a hiring freeze was clamped on this and other institutions in the Department of Mental Hygiene. In the intervening months, Willowbrook lost 600 employees through attrition. For the budget for fiscal 71-72, the governor recommended a hold-the-line appropriation of $630 million for the mental hygiene department. The legislature, seeking to trim the waste and fat from the budget, cut it down to about $600 million. Then the governor decided that even $600 million was too much and cut it even further, all the way down to $580 million. Willowbrook lost another 200 employees, and a situation that 2 years ago was bad became hopeless. The attendants tried to care for their wards, but were simply overwhelmed. The attendant-to-patient ratio, which should be about 4 to 1, dropped to 30 or 40 to 1. And the average feeding time per patient, which should be 20 or 30 minutes, went down to 2 and 3 minutes.
Many of the profoundly retarded children aren't capable of feeding themselves. In my building, we had no staff to train them in a systematic way to use utensils to feed themselves. That can be done, but what's necessary is to feed them. You take a bowl of food that you've made into a mush-like substance with a big spoon, and you ladle it out into their mouth. In the buildings where the kids can't feed themselves, there are so few attendants that there's only an average, it's been timed, 3 minutes per child per feeding.
How much time would be needed to do a job adequately?
The same amount of time that your children or my children would want to have to eat breakfast.
What's the consequence of 3 minutes per meal per child?
The consequence is death from pneumonia.
North of the city, on the way to Bear Mountain, is a lovely-looking place called the Letchworth Village Rehabilitation Center. Set among the hills and woods of suburban Rockland County, a passerby could easily mistake the place for a country club or a college campus. But the early morning mist gave the place an eerie feeling, like a set from a horror movie. And once inside, that feeling became suddenly appropriate. Congressman Mario Biaggi had planned an official tour of the facility for 10 o'clock in the morning, but by this time, wary of what I felt were attempts on the part of the Department of Mental Hygiene to make the situation look better than it really was, my camera crew and I got there 2 hours before that. As the hour of the official tour approached, bundles of clothing were brought in for the children, and a process of cleaning up was begun. Even so, none of these cosmetic changes could do much to improve the place.
Who's in charge here, Jerry?
This is
Mrs. Nixon? I'm Congressman Biaggi. How are you? Why are these patients unclothed?
We don't have enough clothing. We don't have the proper help to keep clothing on them. We have a few nudists that will not keep clothes on. They will pull them off. But most of all, we don't have the help to keep the kids properly dressed.
You're talking about more money for the institution.
Well, that we could use because then we will have more help.
How understaffed are you?
Very understaffed. There are days we have 4 or 5 attendants to take care of 100.
Condition in a very beautiful ground, very well-built buildings. Inside we have housed the children of many of our citizens who are subjected to what appears to be the worst possible conditions I've ever seen in my life. I've visited penal institutions all over the country. I've visited hospitals all over the country. I've visited the worst brigs in the military. Nothing's like it. I've never seen anything like it.
About 25% of the funding for Letchworth Village comes from the federal government, and one of the requirements for continued eligibility is that there be 80 square feet of space per patient. Here they get only 35 square feet. In the face of this terrible overcrowding, there was a ward there that stood empty because they hadn't the funds to hire the 38 people it would take to staff it. How can this be?
Well,